Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Apples and Ginos Fantasy Hockey Podcast, the podcast you come to when you're finally ready to take fantasy hockey seriously. My name is Groot Nibbelink. I'm the creator of Apples and Ginos, originator of the Zero G Draft Strategy, and in this broadcast, I am going to break down how to apply that Zero G Draft Strategy for the 2025-26 season. Let's get it. All right. Well, before we get into the main meat of this episode with this tongue-in-cheek title that I've been running with for the past 3 years now, I think this is the third year we've done this particular episode. But before we get into that, duty to plug the Fantasy Hockey Draft Guide one more time, at least. If you are doing some drafting this week, as I am, which I'm pretty jacked up about, patreon.com/applesgenos. Link will be in the description. Get your hands on this document. 160 plus pages of just fantasy goodness, everything you need to break down each individual team, what we think, top sleepers, all the kind of stuff that you need to break down your fantasy hockey drafts for you. Projections, rankings, it's all there for you. So get your hands on the document if you got a draft coming up this week. Before we really get into the specifics of the goaltender landscape of 2025-26, I do want to take a quick second to do some zero-G review, I guess we could say. So before we even get into that, I am going to give once again my statement on the zero-G strategy. I've given it so many times on this podcast, but people still seem to willfully ignore it. So here goes again. Hopefully it sticks the 11th time. I am not the first person to fade goalies in fantasy hockey drafts, and I've never claimed to be, but Zero G is a lot more than just fading goalies, and I've put a lot of years of research and theory into fashioning this strategy into a more holistic approach to the goaltender position in fantasy hockey. And that strategy has an application and an action for every stage of the fantasy season, not just the draft. And as you can imagine, I take a lot of pride in having created something that has helped a lot, like hundreds, if not thousands, of fantasy managers are now running with the Zero G strategy, calling it the Zero G strategy, and they're beating their rivals with it. And that's why I mention it at the top of every episode. All right, with that out of the way, here is how I would define the Zero-G draft strategy in 2025 with as few words as possible. It is still a bit of a mouthful, but this is how I am thinking about the strategy myself. Goaltenders are the most replaceable and the least predictable players on your fantasy roster. And therefore, we should try to reduce the amount of draft capital we spend on goaltenders to a minimum while still correctly weighing the upside versus risk profile of a goalie pick versus a skater pick throughout your draft. In the season, we should view goalies as dispensable at all times and not tolerate underperforming goalies on a roster when we know there are top tier goalie performances on the waiver wire basically at all times. So that's the definition that I'll leave you with for now. I want to talk about the statement in there, spending less draft capital on goalies than your league mates. If each draft pick has a dollar value, if all of your draft picks all together in your draft add up to $100, then your first round pick is obviously the one that is worth the most dollars, right? It's maybe worth $20 or $30 or some higher number, and everything kind of goes down linearly or maybe exponentially behind that. Each pick is worth less as you get towards the later part of your draft. And so basically, we just want to spend a lot less dollar value on the goaltender position. Now, why do we want to do that? Because goalies are inherently more replaceable than skaters. Think about last year. Mackenzie Blackwood plays for the Sharks, gets traded to the Avalanche, and is instantly a top 5 goaltender rest of season. Sam Montembeault emerges last year. Darcy Kemper was drafted in the double-digit rounds pretty much everywhere last year. Dustin Wolf, rookie, comes in, absolutely smashes, especially over the back half of the season. Lucas Dostal was tremendous, especially early in the season, which nobody saw coming. He was not highly drafted. Kevin Lankinen gets an early run in Vancouver and is amazing for about the first quarter or so of the season as well. Karel Vejmelka gets a ton of starts in Utah. Like, what was it, like 30 straight starts or something ridiculous that he got at the end of the season. So just insane volume. Situations like that can happen. You have Jet Greaves. Somewhere out there, there's somebody who streamed Jet Greaves for the end of the season and got those 5 games where he was basically unbeatable and won their championship because of it. So these are the kinds of things that can happen at the goaltender position in fantasy hockey that just do not happen at other positions. And that is why we fade goalies at all times throughout the season in the draft. And specifically in the draft, if you take a goalie early, you're already losing to whoever hits on a goalie late. And multiple people in your league will hit on a late goalie or two. And so you just want to kind of position yourself to be that person who hits on the goalie late, not the one who invests a ton of capital up front. And that very rarely ends up paying off. Even last year, Hellebuck obviously had a terrific season, but he wasn't even the first goaltender drafted. We didn't get that right. ADP had Shesterkin over Hellebuck on every single site. Another reason we should always be interested in adding the hottest new goalie on the waiver wire. These guys crop up consistently all the way throughout the season, and we should always be interested in that. If you've got guys that you think, I spent too much draft capital on this guy, then you won't be interested in picking those guys up. And sometimes those are the most impactful pickups, and you want to have the ability to make those moves. I think we should really stop thinking about goaltenders as season-long bets and think about them more as 2 to 4 week propositions. Goalies really do ebb and flow constantly throughout the season. Go look at some season-long splits. I tried to do this in the Zero-G episode that I do at the end of every season, reviewing the season from a Zero-G perspective and how it went. I try to break up the season into quarters and kind of show how some goalies are terrific in the first quarter and then never heard from again. Some goalies never show up until the last quarter of the season and then are tremendous in the last quarter of the season for fantasy playoffs, and you had to have them to win your league. So I really do think that we need to view goaltenders this way. This helps us avoid take lock on goalies, avoid holding on to bad goalies for way too long. How long did people hang on to UC Saros last year? A lot of other goaltenders, right? But that's obviously the biggest one that's coming to everyone's mind. And this also allows you to build the best skater room in your league. You focus up front for a long time. You're drafting skaters, and you're not even thinking about a goaltender. All your league mates are hopefully drafting goaltenders, and a lot of them are just falling further and further behind because they're drafting the wrong goaltenders, and they'll hang on to those goaltenders all season long. People will often say to me that you're spending way too many ads on goalies, and I would argue that I'm not. I've gone back and looked at how many ads that I'm spending on goaltenders throughout the season, and I don't think it's crazy to spend roughly 1 ad per week on a goaltender. I don't think that's in most setups. Yahoo is a consistent 4 ads per week, and that setup, if you're using more than 3 ads per week on skaters, you're probably only getting 1 game out of the skater. And in that case, using the single game of 1 skater versus the single game of 1 goalie, probably you should be taking the goaltender more times than not in most point setups and in a lot of cat setups as well. So there's a lot of situations in which I think you should be spending at least 1 ad per week on a goaltender anyway. On average, obviously, it changes throughout the season. And if you don't have to, then you shouldn't. But if that is you, then I don't think you should feel like you're spending too much. I think that I'm not spending too many ads on goaltenders. I'm just realistic about how quickly goaltender performance can change, and I'm not afraid to move off of goaltenders that everybody thinks are good when they're not performing. I think the managers that aren't doing that are often spending way too few ads on goalies and are actively hurting their teams by sticking with guys while they are playing pretty terribly. The end of season results to me for goaltenders are not super interesting to me. I do include them because people still go by those results as the be all end all of goaltender performance for fantasy hockey, but that's just really not how things go. So if you want to check out more info on this, if you want to check out the review from the 2024-25 season that I did, episode 479 has a lot more zero G specific info. With that all out of the way, I'm going to get into my tiers for goaltenders this year. Caveat right off the top, I don't think that my tiers for goaltenders this year are any better than anybody else's. I don't claim to be a goalie prognosticator. I don't project goaltenders. I just look at the situations and I try to guess, just like everybody else, on what they might do. And that's why I really do feel very agnostic to goaltenders in my draft. I look at where I think the value, the risk reward really lines up. And for me, that really doesn't happen a lot until the double digit rounds. And that's where I end up taking goaltenders more often than not. So, Hall of Fame tier, there's two players in this tier for me, Connor Hellebuyck and Andrei Vasilevskiy. Vasilevskiy really only has one bad season, quote unquote bad season on his record, and he was coming back from an injury in that season. I think that it's crazy to think that Hellebuyck and Vasilevskiy are not basically equals in the same tier, have been for multiple years. These guys are on a Hall of Fame trajectory and they should go 1-2 in every draft. And I don't think anybody should debate that. Where they should go in the draft is obviously up for debate and probably depends on your league a little bit, but more often than not, like, I'm never going to see these guys on my teams because they will get drafted by somebody before me in every single draft that I'm in. That's just the reality of it. And so I really don't spend that much time thinking about where I would actually pull the trigger on a Hellebuyck or Vasilevskiy. Realistically, I think it would have to be probably like round 8, 9, somewhere in there before I would draft them. And that's just not happening in any league that I'm in. So that's where I wind up with these two. Jake and Igor are tier 2. Jake Ottinger, Igor Shesterkin. I think after the Hall of Fame guys, these are kind of the next elite 2, just really solidly entrenched volume starters on what should be some good teams. Shesterkin, I think, has all the talent in the world, and the Rangers should have a bounce back year, and so he should be here. Ottinger, I don't think, is maybe necessarily as talented a goaltender as Shesterkin, but I think he can be just as good fantasy-wise because of the situation there in Dallas and how good that team has been and should continue to be. So these guys, I would put, a couple rounds back of the Hellebuyck-Vasilevskiy tier probably, and again, I just don't see myself getting them in a lot of situations. Like, realistically, there's just so many players that I'd rather take swings on, even in the 10th, 11th, and even 12th rounds in a lot of places, that I'm just not that interested in trying to get a goaltender that at that point, in some situations, yeah, for sure, I'm not going to fault somebody for taking these guys if that risk reward profile for them is lining up in that spot. It is really a different approach to goaltenders for me, and I don't fault anybody for feeling the pull. If they did happen to fall to you there, I don't blame you, but that's where I'm at. I'm just being transparent about my process, and a process that has helped me win a lot of leagues against a lot of high tier competition. So next up, the tier 3. For me, this is volume plus environment and good goaltenders, right? Philip Gustafsson, not Philip Forsberg, Philip Gustafsson and Sergei Bobrovsky. I just think both of these guys are set up for a lot of success, had good years last year, and I think they should have good years once again. Bobrovsky only has Daniil Tarasov behind him, should see a fair amount of volume this year. Gustafsson has the rookie coming in behind him this year there in Minnesota, and that just seems to be a situation where he's going to get a ton of volume again, and Minnesota is one of the better environments for a goaltender across the league. So I love that there as well. Tier 4, volume plus good. So this is the goaltenders that I think are good and are slated to get a lot of volume. This is where we really start to get into a bigger tier. Linus Ullmark, Dustin Wolf, Darcy Kemper, Ilya Sorokin, UC Saros, Jacob Markstrom, Aiden Hill, and Mackenzie Blackwood. Blackwood is kind of like an asterisk here, right? I think he would be higher for me. He would be in tier 3 with Bobrovsky and Gustafsson. If we had, a little bit more confidence about the injury situation there, I think he's going to be good to go, but he's missed a lot of time here. This is usually a good time for goaltenders to get into the swing of things, and now he's going to have to kind of start the season on the off foot, as it were, get out of bed on the wrong side of the bed. whatever metaphor you want to use. That's the situation for Blackwood heading into the year. I think the situation is terrific in Colorado, obviously, and he's going to have a lot of opportunity to win a lot of games, but it's just a tough situation to be starting out a little bit banged up. And I wonder if that's going to cause some problems for him. So for me, that's enough to put him in this tier instead of the other tier. And again, within this tier, where you want to place goaltenders, I'm not going to fight you whatsoever. For myself, I do have it in order. The way that I listed it is the way that I have it ordered for myself personally. I do like Ullmark the most of this tier. I think that Ottawa has a good thing going in terms of the defensive system that they've gotten set up under Travis Green should be even better in year 2. I think I like that situation as something similar to what LA did for Darcy Kemper last year, and maybe not to the same extent, but I think it should be somewhat similar, and the results should be somewhat similar for Linus Ullmark this year in Ottawa. Dustin Wolf, I think Calgary plays good team defense, but they might also lose Rasmus Anderson, which would be a big blow, and Calgary as a team could regress a little bit this year. Wouldn't be too surprising, and so he's maybe just a little bit back there for me. Darcy Kemper, I think the team in LA is worse, especially on the back end, than they were a year ago, and so that's the big part for me there. Sorokin and Saros, I think, are big-time volume goaltenders on teams that are pretty uncertain going into this year. I think both of them are still fine goaltenders. It's just, what is that team environment going to look like? Jacob Markstrom, Aiden Hill are just two guys that I think have a lot of potential, but have been a little bit up and down over the last season or two, and so I think their team situations are terrific. It would not surprise me if either of these guys were like a top 5 goaltender on the year at the end of the year because the team situation is so good, but I do have questions about how consistent they can be and how good they actually are at the end of it. Either of them could have a pop-off season, though. Wouldn't surprise me at all. This tier here, if one of these guys slips and I'm getting somebody towards the back end of the tier that is slipping, into those double-digit rounds, into a spot, maybe the 12th or 13th round, especially, where I can get one of these. If that happens in one of my leagues, then I'm really excited about that. I mean, as excited as I can be about goaltenders, I guess. But that's where I end up with some of these, in your standard leagues where people are super overvaluing goaltenders as people have for years, then you're not going to see any of these guys go that late. They're all going to be gone by the double-digit rounds. But if you are in a league where some of them are still kicking around at that point, then I would definitely be considering pulling the trigger. Tier 5, we have guys that I just have more questions about than those in Tier 4. That's Lucas Dostal, Jordan Binnington, Sam Montembeault, Anthony Stolars. So Lucas Dostal has the off-night schedule in Anaheim. He is the entrenched starter now with John Gibson being dealt in the offseason. Should be a better team this year in Anaheim with the new coach, with the young guns taking another step forward hopefully this year. I like what's building in Anaheim. I just don't know. I don't know if the defense is quite there yet, basically, is the question for me. So it very well could be. It very well could be a great year for Lucas Dostal with a ton of off nights, which would obviously help him slot in against other goaltenders that you might have on your team. So that part would be good. But I'm still a little bit leery of Anaheim. I don't know that they're even a middle of the pack team quite yet. Jordan Binnington, I have questions mostly about whether he's going to continue to hold off Joel Hofer, at least for start share. I think that he is still a terrific goaltender. We saw him do it against the USA in the Four Nations. He was terrific there. I think that he's very capable still, but the Blues are in a spot with Joel Hofer, who they paid a bunch of money to this offseason, where they might just decide that they can make this thing a little bit more, 55-45 than it has been in years past in terms of the start share split. And that could take a bit of a chunk out of Jordan Binnington's overall counting stats. Sam Montembeault, I think that Montreal is, the team that has undergone the biggest roster overhaul in terms of big time faces, big time changes this offseason. And sometimes that doesn't always click. So there is that question. I do think they kind of overperformed a bunch of their metrics last year, and that could regress this year, which could create another challenging environment for Montembeault. I think that he should get a lot of starts once again, but he's also never really outperformed for a sustained period. He's never shown us that he's an upper echelon talent for a sustained period, I guess is what I should say. So that's a question that I still have about Montembeault as well. Anthony Stolarz just signed a new deal with the Leafs. Looks like a pretty big steal for the Leafs, honestly. $3.75 million for 4 years. Seems like a really good deal for a guy who had a terrific season last year as part of a tandem with Joseph Woll. Woll is out away from the team for personal reasons. No real update. They have basically said that we don't know when he's back, and that could mean that Anthony Stolarz actually gets a fair bit of run this year, and that could be really exciting. The question there is, this is a guy who has basically never been a starter and has not run off a lot of games in a row, and would he be able to hold up in that situation? That's definitely a question, but definitely a lot of upside for Stolarz too if he is able to get a bigger role this year, if Woll is going to miss some time away from the team throughout the season and Stolarz gets a lot of time, has, gets 2 out of every 3 starts or something along those lines, he could be a huge smash, especially if you're getting him a little bit later on in drafts. Upside tier is tier 6. So these are goaltenders that I think have a lot of upside from where they're being drafted, but also obviously have a lot of questions. Stuart Skinner, Jeremy Swayman, Thatcher Demko, Logan Thompson, Karel Vejmelka, Joey Daccord, and John Gibson. Stuart Skinner, I think, is going to get the vast majority of starts in Edmonton. There's these reports he's come in 20 pounds lighter than he was last year. I think Stuart Skinner, I've heard some interviews with him, and he does seem like a really kind of well-adjusted human being. He's really thinking about what he can do to make himself better. He's, not too worried about the fact that he's had some bad outings, and some people think he's the worst goaltender of all time. He has not performed when the lights have been brightest, and that's a knock on Skinner, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he can't have a pretty solid year for fantasy hockey this year again, and behind a great team in Edmonton. So Stuart Skinner, I think, still has a lot of upside here. I think Jeremy Swayman should have a bounce back year, but I'm pretty scared of the team environment in Boston. That looks like a pretty atrocious forward group on paper, so I'm worried about that. Thatcher Demko could be great, could be terrible, could be somewhere in between, could just split starts with Kevin Lankinen. There's a whole lot of unknowns with Thatcher Demko, but a lot of upside as well. Logan Thompson probably going to split starts with Charlie Lindgren again this year, but what if he doesn't? What if he is getting more and more of those starts as the season wears on? He could be in for a pretty big role on a pretty solid team in Washington and could actually be a guy with a lot of upside, could elevate himself into, one of the top 10 or 15 goaltenders for fantasy hockey this year. Karel Vejmelka, we have Connor Ingram basically on his way out of Utah, and that means Vejmelka is going to be the volume starter for the Utah Mammoth this year. And he has done it before, and he held up. He was maybe not the greatest at the end of the year, facing all that rubber and taking all those starts, but he should be in a spot where he can take that and run with it. Utah looks better again this year. They've made some additions to the team this offseason that should serve them well, and it could be a spot where Vejmelka is behind a team that's even better than they were a year ago and is a volume starter. Could be a great spot. Joey Daccord, I think, is, again, a pretty good goaltender, but Seattle is a really scary team to roster a goaltender on, and so that is the concern there. John Gibson, I think, is going to get a fair amount of volume in Detroit. I think he is going to be the, 60% starter, 60-40 split, something along those lines in Detroit. So I think he could have some value, especially in volume-based leagues, points leagues especially. I don't know if Detroit is a terrific goaltender environment, but he had a great year under the radar, really, in Anaheim last year when he was healthy. He has very struggled to stay healthy. It is an understatement with John Gibson. It seems like he's always leaving games and missing a day or two here and there throughout the season. And lower body stuff, especially with goaltenders, that is something that I do worry about. I do ascribe some weight to the injury narrative there. So that is a concern for me with Gibson as well. Keeps him down in kind of the bottom of this upside tier, tier 6. In tier 7, we've got deep shots. This is Spencer Knight, Frederick Anderson, Peter Kochetkov, Jet Greaves, Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen. Basically, we're getting pretty deep into it. Start with the Carolina guys here, Anderson and Kochetkov. Either of these guys, if they're getting all the starts, would be really interesting for fantasy for obvious reasons. Carolina's a great team, but they've basically said that once again, they expect to split starts completely 50-50, which just saps a lot of the fantasy value from both of these players. If you're in a Cats league that's more rates-based and you just need the one start each week, week that should be pretty good, then maybe you can swing it. But more often than not, you need a guy who you're planning to get 2 starts every single week. Spencer Knight, I think, can be a good goaltender. I think Chicago is a really terrifying defensive environment. Jet Greaves, I think, is really interesting. We've talked about it. I made a tweet somewhere in the offseason, I think it was in July, about Jet Greaves being the 0G goaltender of the 2025-26 season. I think that's definitely possible. I think that's in the cards for Jet Greaves. I don't think Merzlikins is necessarily a great goaltender, and he could be on the way out in Columbus, especially if Jet Greaves can retain even a modicum of the just elite level play he put on show in that 5 games to end the season last year. So Jet Greaves, pretty interested in what he might be able to do. I'll be paying very close attention to what they are doing in terms of start share and everything in Columbus this year. Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, it's really, can Buffalo take a step this year? Have any of the changes they've made really manifested in any true upgrade for the team, for the defensive environment? I'm not convinced, but if it does, then we could see something better this year for UPL. On the watch list, we have Joseph Woll. Obviously, he's going to have to come back to Toronto, but again, should be close to a 50-50 split when he is there. So could have something there. And if Stolars were to go down to injury, then Woll would obviously be pretty interesting. Tristan Jarry, Elvis Merzlikins, guys that could get some volume early on for their respective teams, but you can't possibly be excited about. Artur Shilovs could, displace Jarry and get into that spot. But again, it's Pittsburgh. How excited are you going to be? Samuel Ersson has not been great. You hope that Rick Tocchet changes some things about how this team plays hockey, and it is a good situation for Ersson, and he can kind of solidify himself this year. But, you're asking a lot there still. Yaroslav Askarov in San Jose. I just don't know how you can confidently predict anything for a guy like Askarov in San Jose. Probably one of the worst top or bottom 5, I guess, defensive environments in the league, you have to assume. And even if he's getting volume, I don't know if he'll be viable for fantasy purposes. Then tier 9, these are the guys I would consider an injury away. Joel Hofer, Kevin Lankinen, Calvin Pickard, Daniel Vladar, Alex Lyon, Charlie Lindgren, Cam Talbot, Jake Allen, Anton Forsberg, Casey DeSmith, Daniil Tarasov, Levi Marilainen. Again, you could kind of order these guys however you want. I like Hofer. I think if Binnington did go down to injury at any point, Joel Hofer could be the 0G guy of the year. That could definitely happen. But, you could say that about a lot of these, like Daniil Tarasov. If Bobrovsky went down in Florida, do you think that Tarasov, who was a pretty highly thought of prospect once upon a time, after learning from Bobrovsky, who by all accounts is one of the best to ever do it in terms of his preparation, if he could learn something from Bobrovsky and kind of turn his career around, I could definitely see a situation in which Tarasov, as bad as he was in Columbus, kind of turns his career around in Florida. We've seen stranger things from goaltenders. Marilainen had a good run for Ottawa last year, could have another good run this year. Forsberg could get some run behind Kemper, and if Kemper were to miss some time, which he has in the past, you could see Forsberg for an extended stretch, and he could put up some numbers. You could say that about a lot of these. Obviously, Lindgren could do the same behind Thompson. Basically, all these guys, I think, are an injury away from being quite relevant for fantasy. And lastly, in tier 10, these are the guys I have to mention. Connor Ingram, who has been waived by Utah and will probably end up somewhere else at some point. Hasn't gone anywhere yet, but we'll find out what's going to go on there. And wherever he goes, he could be one of these injury away guys. So keep an eye on the name Connor Ingram. He has had some strings of success in the past. Wouldn't be crazy to see him pop up and have a little bit of success on a good opportunity somewhere else this year. And Philip Grubauer, I have to put on here because Kevin Woodley shouted him out on the pod that he did with Blake over the summer. And I do not know nearly as much about goaltending as Kevin Woodley does. And so I have to shout him out. I am still struggling to see it with Philip Grubauer. But, if Kevin Woodley says it, I've got to take notice. So he is on the list and we will see what he does this year. Maybe he has truly figured some things out and he's going to resurrect his career this year. There is another goaltender that some people are getting excited about that is out there, but I am not interested in that goaltender. It's been a long time since he played hockey, and I'm not interested in having him on my teams. So that is all I will say about that. If you're interested in more content, then we have a live draft streaming schedule headed your way. I'm streaming a $100 buy-in Bangers Cats draft on Tuesday, September 30th, 9:15 p.m. EST. Then I'm streaming the Tier 1 APL Apples and Ginos Patron League draft on Thursday, October 2nd at 9:30 p.m. EST. On Sunday, October 5th at 1:30 p.m. EST in the afternoon, I am streaming my Tier 1 Cacuffle auction draft, so if you're interested in auction content, that's going to be a good live stream to join. And then Blake is going to be live streaming the Fantasy Puck Content Creators Draft, which is Monday, October 6th, 7 p.m. EST. So definitely check those out if you are interested in watching us do some drafting live. If you made it this far, you should definitely click the link in the description. Join the Discord community. Tons and tons of managers talking fantasy hockey, comparing notes all day long. If you could like, rate, review, subscribe, comment on this podcast, this YouTube episode, wherever you are consuming this content, really does help us out. But that is going to be all that I've got for this episode. So hopefully it brought you some value, helped you get a little bit better at fantasy hockey today. All the advanced stats you heard today came from Natural Stat Trick. Don't think I used any advanced stats because I talked about goaltenders. But many thanks to Matt Creamer for supplying the music for the podcast. That's going to be it, folks. Much love.